Welcome to Bible study. This is the Bible study we're preparing for December 17th, the third Sunday of Advent in 2023 at St. Michael's Lutheran Church. We'll be talking about these readings this Sunday in church in our Bible study, and so if you can make it to that, you're more than welcome. Hope you can be there. We've been engaged in the book of Acts here all fall, and well, we've made some progress, but we've got a lot left to go. We're in chapter 9. If you have a Bible handy, I'd encourage you to grab that. Last week, we finished the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. And we talked about how in this chapter, Luke was talking about the gospel spreading into all directions, to the Samaritans, to the Ethiopians. But here in chapter 9, he's going to really take up the primary thrust of the gospel proclamation for Theophilus, his audience. And that's going to be the westward expansion of the church and the good news all the way to the city of Rome. For Theophilus, who has a very Greek name, very much a part of the Roman Empire, that's what would have been important to him. And that's probably why we're going that way. But also, this character that we're going to have more fully introduced to us and explained for us is going to be central to that entire endeavor. Most of the chapters that are following this one will be focused on this Saul of Tarsus, who will soon be known as the Apostle Paul. So let's get into this story a little bit. My Bible right here talks about the conversion of Saul, but we really want to put a quotation mark around that word conversion. When you read his letters, the letters that Paul wrote to the various congregations, it becomes very clear that he does not understand himself as having a conversion. He did not change religions. He didn't go from being Jewish to Christian. He understood his Christianity as an authentic form or an authentic expression of the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That if he was to be a true son of the Torah, a true follower of the God of the Old Testament, it meant for him worshiping Jesus. That was the only way that he could authentically, truly, completely be Jewish. So maybe the better word for it would be completion or fulfillment of his Judaism as a Christian. Now, I think the other part that you really want to talk about it maybe does work with that word conversion a little bit, because inside the word conversion is the word turn. This is one of the great turnaround stories of all human history. And the fact that it's woven so early into the Christian movement is really important. Now, reading our Gospels, we've already seen a number of these turnaround stories. The disciple Matthew had been a tax collector before he followed Jesus. The story of Jesus calling Zacchaeus out of the tree is another turnaround story. But there's others, the Samaritan woman at the well. The Gospels are full of Jesus finding and putting into his kingdom people who are the most unlikely of candidates. But it's also pretty interesting that all of those accounts were written down after this event happened. That Jesus didn't stop collecting some really unexpected and surprising people in the early church, and has not stopped doing that even to this day. That within the ranks of Christianity, there is always room for that person that you would never imagine could say, I believe in Jesus. If you've ever sung the hymn Amazing Grace, you probably know that's another one of those turnaround stories. John Newton had been engaged in the slave trade as a sailor during the 18th century. More recently, Chuck Colson, the advisor to the corrupt Richard Nixon administration, had a conversion when he was in prison and went on to start the prison fellowship ministries. Christianity is sometimes at its very best when it is taking people that have fallen far and raising them up. This story that we're about to experience is maybe archetypal in that sense of a turnaround story. Now, as we read it, we are going to want to do a little bit of a comparison. So we're not going to go real far into chapter 9 this week, but what we are going to do is look a little bit later in the book of Acts and notice that Paul actually retells this story a couple of times. In chapter 22, as he is brought before the Sanhedrin and the people of Jerusalem as they seek to arrest him toward the end of the book, he makes a defense of himself and he tells this story. Again then, in chapter 26, as he is before the king, Agrippa, and the governor, Paul tells again the story of his conversion. What's very interesting is, and I would encourage you to read those, is that they're all a little different. There could be a lot of reasons why that is, but what's probably true, or what definitely is true, is that as Luke is writing this story in chapter 9, this third-person narratival event, he knows what Paul has said. He already has the last chapters of the book written. And he has probably heard Paul tell this story hundreds of times. I can only imagine that his own conversion narrative factored into all of Paul's missionary work. It's very interesting to ask, why did he tell it differently? Why did Luke not bring the stories into some sort of a congruence with each other? Well, we'll just have to talk about that. If you have any questions about that, I encourage you to get a hold of me. Saul, we ran into him at the end of chapter 7, the man in front of whom the people laid their coats at the stoning of Stephen. Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Clearly, it isn't just Saul doing this. I mean, if he's going to be bringing prisoners back, he's even going to need help. But this is part of a much larger and systematic sort of persecution. It is authorized by the chief priest, who really was the governor of Jerusalem itself. He was kind of the mayor of the city. And so this is now becoming much more widespread. They had been simply persecuting the leadership of the Christian movement, Peter and John and the apostles. But with Stephen, something seems to have broken. They realize that it isn't just the leaders who are spreading dangerous ideas, it's all the Christians. And now they feel they need to exterminate, get rid of this movement. Saul, as he went on his way, approached Damascus. And suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." It's very interesting that that Jesus doesn't say, "You're persecuting my people," but he identifies with all of those men and women who've been thrown in jail and who maybe have been murdered. And he says, "I was in each one of them." For persecuted people, that's a really important message. Jesus never forgets about you. He's always, in fact, suffering with you. Your suffering is his suffering. And it connects you to his suffering on the cross. It connects you to him. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Take note of that. The description of the men changes a little bit here in the other tellings. Saul rose up from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. He's blind. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. This has been clearly a psychologically traumatic experience for him. Now, there was at Damascus a disciple named Ananias, not the one that we ran into earlier, another Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." And he said, "Here I am, Lord." This response, by the way, is common throughout the Bible. It's actually today, in Aramaic or Hebrew, it's still the word that school children use when the teacher calls roll. The teacher says, "John Smith, are you here?" John Smith says, "Hineni, here I am." The Lord said to him, "Rise and go to the street called Straight." Now, Damascus is a very dangerous place to be right now. It's ruled by a wicked dictator. But there still is a street there called Straight. It's the same street. It's still there. At the house of Judas, look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from chief priests to bind all who call on your name." Ananias says, "Jesus, are you sure?" But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias departed and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, he said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me, so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. And then he rose and was baptized. And taking food, he was strengthened. That story is absolutely central to the proclamation of the gospel. Next to Jesus himself in the New Testament, this Saul of Tarsus, soon to be named Paul the Apostle, is the most pivotal figure in the New Testament. He's going to go on to write 13 letters that we read in the New Testament. He will be the primary focus of the rest of the chapters of the book of Acts, primarily. He's just that important. So it's worth it to stop and look. Read those other stories, those other accounts of it. And I want you to notice particularly, as we noted, the role of the men, but also then the role of Ananias and how that changes in here. And how much Jesus says to Saul. We get different and more details as this unfolds. It's a fascinating little study that focuses our attention maybe on the things that Luke really wants us to see. We hope to see you on Sunday. If you have any questions about this, of course, send me an email, give me a call. Love to talk to you about it. God bless you all.